There is increasing evidence to support the correlation between the use of media violence and aggressive behaviour. In a world where we are constantly surrounded by media violence, this has prompted great concern amongst the population and called for further tests to be conducted. Albert Bandura first theorised this theory through his observational learning theory, which postulated that people acquired new attributes by the observation of the behaviours of others. He conducted an experiment whereby he measured the imitation learning in relation to non-aggressive and aggressive models and discovered that participants who viewed aggressive models imitated their behaviour to a much greater extent than those who viewed non-aggressive models. This suggested that the mere observation of aggression is a sufficient condition for imitation aggression and provided a starting point for my chosen study. Building on this theme, I have chosen to discuss an article entitled Longitudinal Effects of Media Violence on Aggression and Empathy Among German Adolescents, written by Barbara Cray and Ingrid Müller, two German professors. I consider this study took the idea of the observational learning theory and tested it further with more refined control factors over an extended period of time to develop a richer understanding of the relationship between media violence and behavioural aggression. This article presented a large sample of early adolescents in Germany, relating their habitual use of media, including TV, interactive games, and movies, to self-reports of aggression and empathy over a 12-month period. It was hypothesized that the socialization of exposure to media violence would correlate in higher levels of physical aggression and lower empathy. The participants of this experiment comprised of 1,277 Berlin high school students, with a mean age of 13 years at time period 1, and 14 years at time period 2. The experimental design of this study was repeated measures. Participants were provided with a list of genres for movies, TV series, and video games, and asked to indicate both their habitual media use and the corresponding media violence on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being non-violent and 5 being violent. Participants were then categorised into two different groups. The first was those who scored 2 or more on violence in media usage were considered as aggressive media users, and those who scored under 2 were non-aggressive media users. Participants were then asked to complete a self-report on empathy and a self-report on aggression. The tests were conducted at an initial testing called T1 and a testing 1 year later called T2, and were completed in a classroom during class hours as a group. Results were compiled into a table of descriptive data concerning the media usage habits of the sample and the findings from self-reports. This data was analysed to create a cross-logged panel analysis through the use of M+ software for both aggression and empathy. The cross-log panel analysis results indicated a statistically significant correlation between media violence exposure at T1 and aggressive behaviour at T2 of 0.14. There was no significant pathway from non-violent media usage at T1 to aggression at T2. Results for empathy revealed a significant pathway from media usage at T1 to reduce high media usage at T1 to reduced empathy at T2 of negative 0.08. The role of T1 aggression as a moderator of the effects was examined through regression analysis. It was found that those who reported low trait aggression at T1 combined with high media usage at T2 resulted in high aggression at T2. However, scores did not differ for those with initial high aggression at T1. The data supported the socialization hypothesis, whereby the significant use of media violence stimuli contributed to increased aggressive behaviour over time. This evidence is in line with the results of Slater and al., who found concurrent but no lagged effects of aggression on media violence exposure while controlling for overall aggression scores across different variables. Given that no path was found from non-violent media usage at T1 to aggression at T2, it is suggested that differences in T2 aggression are dependent upon a participant's violent media diet. The data also supported the prediction that media violence exposure resulted in lower empathy. It is suggested that compassion for victims in the real world is reduced by habitual exposure to media violent content. This is consistent with the general aggression model by Anderson and Bushman, which identified that repeated exposure to violence in the media reduced emotional responsiveness to violence due to habituation. Media usage at T1 was found to interact with T1 aggression in the prediction of T2 aggression given low aggression at T1. This is supported by Anderson, who found that participants low in trait irritability showed a greater access to aggressive thoughts after watching a violent video clip, whereas those high in initial trait irritability did not respond differently than the control group watching non-violent clip. It is suggested that media violence exposure would not make a significant difference to the individuals with high levels of trait aggression initially. I am now going to examine the strengths and weaknesses within this report. Firstly, I believe self-reports are effective as they are a simple and inexpensive method of measuring adherence and non-adherence, and it can be assumed that those who are non-adherent are more likely to be truthful. However, these reports rely entirely on a subjective point of view of the person, which could hinder the inaccuracy of the results. Given that the test was conducted as a group in a classroom, it is likely that students pick their answers based on the social desirability bias and the majority of the class results. In the future, it is suggested that the experiments conduct controlled measures alongside self-reports to ensure a more accurate and controlled set of data. The design method has an obvious strength in that the same participants are used at both T1 and T2, allowing the researcher to exclude the effects of individual differences, such as IQ, ability, and age that could occur across independent groups. However, it is limited as there is no guarantee that all participants will return to the T2 testing. And secondly, different circumstances may have taken place outside the experiment which differ from T1 to T2, thus biasing the results. A solution to this limitation could be to control the measures of a person's living environment for the duration of the test. The results were tested to be reliable, with a p-value of less than 0.001 for both the correlation between media violence and physical aggression and media violence and empathy. Secondly, the inclusion of non-violent media usage provided a contrast in the set of data to further enhance the relationship between violent media usage and aggression. The results are limited as the test for empathy only had 2 data sets and required a third wave of results to reliably correlate the factor. Secondly, the results did not test sufficient contributing factors to aggression. The finding that media violent exposure differentiated between participants low in trait aggression but not among those high in initial trait aggression could suggest that there is a more powerful risk factor that could be involved in the latter group, overriding the potential impact of violent media content. Additional tests would be required to prove if there is other potential risk factors. Despite these limitations, the overall conclusion of the experiment was proved statistically significant, suggesting that differences in the habitual usage of violent media stimuli contribute to the prediction of differences in aggressive behaviour over time. This is supported by the observational learning theory, as stipulated above, and Albert Bandura's imitation of aggressive model experiment, and thus can be shown to be theoretically accurate. Further longitudinal studies are needed to explore the role of media violence usage as an independent measure on aggression in adolescents, placing it in context with other risk factors. Thank you for listening to my report today, and I hope you enjoyed it.